Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending where you are joining us from. My name is Alexandre Alaphilippe. I'm the Executive Director of EU DisinfoLab, and welcome to our weekly, these days, webinars of EU DisinfoLab. Before we start this fantastic webinar today with Alberto, just a few housekeeping rules important for you to know, so how we're going to interact with each other. So today we'll use slido.com for all of our Q&A system. So I would encourage you to scan the code you can see on your screen, so you can already join Slido. It will be way easier to ask questions during the presentation, so we can actually have a look at it. We'll have approximately 20-25 minutes for Q&A at the end of this presentation, so you will have the opportunity to ask many questions to Alberto on this fantastic investigation. So you can whether scan the QR code or go to slido.com and use the hashtag disinfo. And I'm going to ask Maria to display the survey so we can already see how many of you are joining. And please tell us where you are joining us from today. And already 4 people are typing. So Brussels, the UK, Singapore. Good evening in Singapore. Only 5 people. We have much more people in this webinar. So please, people, let us know where you joined from. Helsinki. We have a very active Finnish community. UK, Vienna. And while you are still typing there, a few things. And as we said, if you're using the Q&A to type where you are from, we can't see your response if it's not in Slido. So while you are still typing, today, we're very happy to have Alberto with us, Alberto Fittareli from CitizenLab. The title of the webinar today is Paperwall, Chinese websites posing as local news outlets target global audiences with pro-Beijing content. And I'm going to ask Alberto to go on stage. Alberto Fittareli is a senior researcher leading the disinformation research at the CitizenLab, University of Toronto. Alberto, you have acquired 15 years of experience in investigating disinformation, so there is no secret for you on how to investigate these kind of networks, or maybe there are, and you will tell us, disinformation and digital threats, and you acquired much of these skills leading research at Meta, formerly Facebook, and now you are at CitizenLab. So today we're going to talk about Paperwall. I think there is a trend recently of looking mostly at Russia as a threat actor for disinformation, and it's very often forgotten that Russia is not alone in managing foreign influence operations. And these Paperwall investigations was very interesting in bringing together research and adding additional investigations to research on how Chinese private firms can be seen as aggressively managing foreign influence campaign on behalf of the Chinese government. So really acting as intermediaries to push specific narratives. And in this case, at CitizenLab, you found more than 120 websites posing as local news, channeling targeted attacks to Beijing's critics. And while in fact, all of these operations was being run by a PR, public relations firms in Shenzhen. Alberto, we can't wait to hear your presentations. We have 25 minutes and we'll be back then for questions. Alberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alexandre, and the EU DisinfoLab team for having me today. So let me share my screen. It will take a second. Please bear with me. Alexandre, can you confirm you can see the slides? I'll take it as a yes. You're muted.
It's definitely a yes. It was a yes, a silence yes, which is a vocal yes now.
Let me maximize, and we're good to go. So again, I'm not gonna repeat the introduction on Paperwall. We published this report with the CitizenLab at the beginning of February, so about a couple months ago now. Paperwall is an investigation, that started in October 2023, so at the end of last year, when an Italian newspaper called Il Foglio published a story about 6 websites in Italy, or posing as Italian websites, and posing as local news outlet. The reason why they published that story is that they found that none of them actually corresponded to a real news organization. In Italy, it's mandatory to register in the local registry for news organizations, news outlets, and you have to have a newsroom in the country in order to be able to present yourself as a news organization based in Italy. None of them actually had any of those requirements filled. So what you see on the slide is the English version of that report that piqued my curiosity, quite frankly, and that pointed to China potentially being behind it, broader China. Now, we started looking at the main features of these 6 websites initially. We verified that the content, and this was described by Folio, by the way, this is literally one of the screenshots they published on their own story. The content on the website was mostly copied from real local news organizations. It was literally taken and reposted verbatim on their own website, but it was taken from real news organizations, real newspapers in Italy. Content, as a consequence, content was mostly in Italian. I would probably say 80 to 90% in Italian, but with some odd articles staying in English. And you can see a couple of examples there from the screenshot that Il Foglio published. They published a specific research. They found that searching for Xi Jinping on one of the websites returned English-speaking articles only, English language articles only. And those articles in general they had a focus on China, and they promoted the Beijing views, or even directly quoted Chinese state media. And we'll see examples of that later in the presentation today. So with that in mind, we set out to look at a couple of things. First of all, Il Foglio, the press organization in Italy, they mentioned that they looked at the hosting IPs for those 6 websites again. And they verified they were on Tencent, they were owned by Tencent, which is literally a quote from the English version of that article that says, Tencent building, which is linked, Tencent, of course, the company is linked to the Chinese Ministry of Security, that was. Now, we verified in the Tencent cloud documentation that anyone with a valid phone number and a valid method of payment, so a credit or a debit card, could literally have their own website hosted on Tencent cloud IPs. So obviously that's not enough for an attribution to a Chinese organization and or the Chinese government, again. But we wanted to dig a little bit more into what was behind this website, why they were posing as a local news website, and they were reposting content from actual local news without having a real presence and while having IPs based out of China. So obviously the discrepancy was interesting nevertheless. We started from the IP addresses. We had, out of the 6 websites, we had about 3 IP addresses. One was a null one in that by the time we started the investigation, that IP address, that Amazon IP address you see at the top of the table, was not used anymore, but we still had a couple of IP addresses, one in particular that was still used, and it was associated with Tencent, and a previous one on Tencent as well. So we started from that. We found out to 123 domains. Now you see an exclamation mark there, not because 123 domains is a high number, surprisingly high number for an IP address to host domains on. In fact, an IP address can host 1 million domains or more. But in this case, 123 domains were all presenting, at least from the look at you can see a snippet on the slide, from the look at the domain names, they all presented the same features. They all seem to have, for example, a city name, and then generic words associated to press-related topics like Times or Post or even tech, press, and so on and so forth. They all had the same pattern in terms of domain name registration. So at a first glance, with a couple of exceptions that we presented in the report that we don't think were related necessarily, all of the other ones posted on the 3 IP addresses and a few other IP addresses we identified in the process appear to be associated with each other. They appear to be a single, wide, consistent, and closely tied network. So again, this is just a snippet of the entire list of the domains we identified. They all present similar features, and we'll see what those features will be in the following slides. Starting from the content. This is just a summary of the content we were able to categorize at a high level. The main bucket, by main, I mean the importance of the bucket in terms of how impactful the content could potentially be, was the political content. This, however, was just a fraction of the total of the content posted by the network. So you see that you have 2 sub-buckets: original content that we could not trace to other websites or other entities online at any point in time. And that includes a couple of categories that we'll see in a minute. And then important content, typically Chinese state media. And in that case, it was attributed to the Chinese state media in question. But I'm going to throw a number, but it's highly imprecise. It's impossible. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of pieces of content. But it's impossible to quantify, almost impossible to quantify the exact proportion. But I would say about 80% of the content of those websites, or even more, was the scraping of local mainstream media. Like I mentioned, for the Italian website, it was generic news content taken from local news in the country that was actually targeted by the individual website and reposted equally. And then you have a number of commercial press releases. The website, all of them, they had a section for commercial press releases, and the majority of them pertain to crypto content. And on all of them, you could see automotive topics, for example, or financial topics, and other things as well. So you could see a mix of political content overall, the scraping of local mainstream media to probably appear as legitimate news organizations, while copying content from other news organizations, excuse me. And then the commercial aspect of that, so the financially motivated one, which was the reporting of press releases by probably paying customers. Now, going down to the specific examples, we have a couple here of targeted attacks. You see one of the figures, as she's known as a Beijing critic, specifically related to COVID topics. Yan Limang, she's a now US-based virologist who's being attacked by the website for being a complete rumor maker. Now, the background for that is that Yan Limang accuses the Chinese government of being behind essentially the generation and diffusion of the COVID-19 virus. And regardless of the fact that her theories have been widely dismissed by the scientific community internationally, these attacks appear to be on the character, their character assassination. They don't question the merit of her statements, but rather the fact that she's a complete rumor maker, for example. And on the right-hand side, you can see an example of an attempt at blocking a professional appointment, a professional opportunity for Yan Limang, whether true or not, but she was proposed apparently for an appointment to the Paperwall Medical School at the University of Pennsylvania. And the campaign that was diffused by the network, by the Paperwall network, across these different websites and in multiple countries, let's keep it in mind, was about blocking that appointment. She didn't deserve it, according to the network itself. What you see on the left is a mix of screenshots from different websites in different countries, specifically the Netherlands, Spain, and a couple from Italy at the bottom, about the same article. Yan Limang is a complete rumor maker, which was repeated over and over across about 100 websites overall. The second subcategory in the political content that we could verify was what we could call the anti-US conspiracy theories. Now, on the left, we actually put that in the report. You can see an example of an article claiming that the US government is conducting human experiments on the Thai-Myanmar border. Why that specific location, we don't necessarily know, but the picture in the screenshot is actually taken, in the article is actually taken from an Amazon published book. You can see, the text is barely drafted, but it's definitely attacking the US government for something that's verifiably untrue. On the right-hand side, what you see is an example that was actually identified by the national broadcaster in Japan, NHK, and they put in their own article on the Paperwall network, which pertains specifically to Japanese audiences. And apparently, the network in this case was claiming there was an accident in which the activity leaked from an American warship anchored in a location in Japan, of course. So this is about undermining trust between the Japanese population and the US government in the topic, in the context of the US military presence in Japan. Moving on to what I discussed. So if you remember the original summary, we had the red topic, the red bucket, which was a political content that we had the vast majority of the content being lifted from real news organizations. This is actually one example of that. You can see on the left, one Paperwall website, AFL Post, reposting exactly in an identical way, excuse me, an article from Le Parisien, which is obviously a real news organization in France, about an actress. Now, the content itself in this case, not necessarily relevant to the network itself. It's about showing legitimacy, or claiming legitimacy as a news organization. Obviously, a distracted reader could look at AFL Post, see the content, maybe recognizing it from Le Parisien as well, and thinking it could possibly be affiliated to Le Parisien and therefore legitimate, and come across the political content as a consequence and consider it legitimate as well. That's probably the tactic that was being followed here. This is about, again, 80%, 90% of the content we can see across the different websites in the network, excuse me. And finally, the financially motivated, the commercially driven content, which is mostly about crypto. This is an example from one of the original websites identified in Italy by Folio, but there's many more, of course. They typically stay in English, so you can see the language remaining there, and they probably don't, quite frankly, they don't work, they don't have a lot of impact in the local audiences. They get about Italy, but also other countries, because it stays in English. And that's valid for the political content too. But it's also very common to find it. One thing we could identify was the advertisement of placement, content placement, by a small number of agencies in Asia, not exclusively out of China. We had a couple that we identified in South Korea, for example, claiming the possibility, the ability to place paid promotional content on what we call, obviously, the Paperwall network, a website. They were claiming these were major local media in Europe, for example. So obviously to an Asian, maybe not extremely informed audience in this case, potential client about the local media landscape in Europe, that could appear as a legitimate website and therefore generate an audience, potentially a client base for the company. They were trying to sell that kind of content and that kind of audience as a consequence. So we had a mix between politically driven motivation and financially motivated operations as well, which is quite relevant in this case. Going to the audiences, this is just a visual representation of the amount of websites we could see targeting the different countries. Now, for Russia, we could possibly expand it to Central Asia to some extent as well. I apologize. For some of the websites, we could see some focus on the Central Asian region as well, so Kazakhstan, the Uzbekistan countries. We could see that in Asia, Japan and South Korea were mostly targeted, but for the rest, we had Europe as a main target, Latin America to some extent, just one website targeting the US audiences, and a couple in Mexico, I believe. I actually have the right numbers in the original report. So obviously, what you can see in the map is a complete lack of targeting of Africa as of now, and also of the rest of Asia, including Southeast Asia, for example, India, but also other major countries like the Philippines and even Australia and Oceania in general. Now, one thing that we identify and that we explain as a, I ask you to be patient just 1 second. Let me sip water for a moment. My voice is breaking. I apologize, Alexandre.
Don't worry, Alberto. That's life. If you want to take 30 seconds to drink more, that's no problem.
It's nice to be live online on this kind of things. So one thing that we could identify is the anonymous source of most of the political content, but not exclusively. Some of the commercial content as well, which was, you may have noticed that in a previous screenshot, Times Newswire. Times Newswire is a website that, to my knowledge, is still online today, claims to be a newswire, and was previously identified by Mandiant, the cybersecurity company owned by Google, as the source, or at least associated to a campaign, to an influence campaign they called High Energy. That website is completely anonymous, even as we could not identify the operators of the website, although we note some interesting consistencies with the Paperwall network as well, including the IP addresses they were using, but that's not necessarily sufficient for us to call it an attribution to the same Paperwall operators. It did post targeted attacks, similar to what Paperwall does, which is very unusual, of course. Very unusual is probably not the right word. It's completely out of character for a newswire organization. We found that most of the attacks, that you can see a couple of examples there, that do not exist anymore on Times Newswire as of now, because they're typically removed a while after being posted. So the technique in that case would be they're posted, they're seeded, they're spread through the Paperwall network, potentially other networks too, although we could not find other networks spreading these specific pieces of content, and then removed from the source to make it more difficult to trace the original source of the content. We're getting towards the end of the slide deck, so I'll be able to rest my voice for a second. Apologies again. Now, attribution, which is the juicy part, of course. We were able to link the two originally registered domains by Paperwall, specifically two websites called WDPP and updatenews.info, wdpp.org, and updatenews.info. You can see them in the screenshot, through an AdSense ID that was placed on both websites, but also, and this is an important bit of information that I don't necessarily show on the slide, at the same time or even shortly prior to being posted on the PR website, the PR company website. And of course, the same AdSense ID is posted on two fake websites, we should say, the PR website, PR company website, HiMi, and a mirror website for the same PR company. Now, the timing is important because obviously you can copy code, and this is obvious. You can copy code that reposted on the website from a public website. But the timing, first of all, there's no apparent reason for doing that in this case. And also the timing is important because we see the appearance of that AdSense ID at more or less at the same time in archived versions of the website. Possibly even, like I mentioned, possibly even starting with the fake website and then appearing on the PR company website. Although we cannot prove it because obviously that's relying on what's archived of, say, for example, the Wayback Machine. The websites are the official one for the PR company, HiMi, and we can see that in the next slide. It's a company that was allegedly established, according to public records, allegedly established in 2019. It's based in Shenzhen, China, obviously. And it was previously linked by a report by the South Korea Cybersecurity Agency, which is part of the intelligence agencies in South Korea, to the Korean Paperwall website. So obviously there's, I believe, 18 websites in Korea that can be attributed to the same, that can be included into the Paperwall network. NCSC had analyzed this particular website, and although they don't necessarily publish the information they use in order to attribute to HiMi, they were able to point HiMi to link to HiMi to these 16 websites. So it's not necessarily an unknown entity in the context of Paperwall and the broader network. But it's important that we now have a publicly available piece of evidence that we can conclusively link to HiMi as well. And what you see on the screenshot is the public record that's available for the company. It's automatically translated, so the formatting issues that you have there come from the auto translation in browser. So the conclusions. This is, so Paperwall is, but also was, a large and then fast-growing network of websites. I should probably mention that if you check the website today, most of them appear to be offline, which is not entirely surprising after we published the report. But they were also intermittent at the time we were analyzing them. So they were offline for a couple of days, then coming back online. It was difficult to analyze them consistently. It's similar to high energy. I will direct you to Mandian's report on that. There's actually 2 reports in 2022, 2023. But that particular operation, high energy, was targeting US audiences, and they had their own tactics, which were different from this one. In the case of Paperwall, Paperwall is building their own infrastructure. They're registering their own domains, creating their own website, and scraping the content independently from real news organizations. And they also had different audiences, which is pure speculation, of course, but it makes me think that they had a different contract, essentially. They had to target different audiences as part of that contract. The impact, this is a question I typically get, the impact was minimal that we know of today. In terms, and we measure that out of the traffic that we could measure through open source tools to the website. But the danger is that an influence operation, and this is going to be very well known to all of us listening today, all of you listening today, the impact of an influence operation can only be measured after the impact is realized. It actually happened. And in this case, we didn't have that impact that we know of again, but the danger was that. And the moment a piece of political content or target attack was legitimized by a political actor, for example, or a mainstream news organization in the West, so to speak, that could have amplified the impact exponentially, of course. And it shows, once again, there's an important point. It shows, once again, the role that private companies play on behalf, or at least in alignment with the Chinese government. Obviously, we don't have a conclusive link between the company itself and the Chinese government, but the injection of politically related content and specifically targeted attacks on Beijing critics into commercially, what appears otherwise to be a commercially driven operation, makes us think that it was more than just alignment. And that was the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Alberto. And you have
Thank you.
a bit of time to drink a bit of water to recover your voice. We are all with sore throats these days, coping with the weather in Europe. So thank you for this. Please send your question to through Slido. We're going to display it. I think, Maria, if you could stop sharing your screen. That's it. So we had maybe a bit of issues with sound system, but so basically join us at slido.com #disinfo to ask your questions. I received another question on another medium, which I found very interesting. In terms of, I would say, seeing the operation into multiple phases, do you think that the intent of placing pro-PCC disinformation on these websites was the original intent, or do you think it became something that they could do as an intermediary to actually sell this, but like the initial intent was mostly to create a network of dummy media outlets for more like advertising revenue, and then became something else over time? Would that be one of the hypotheses that you have, Alberto?
It's a very interesting question. It's a question that we've been pondering ourselves. Honestly, it's hard to answer that question. I would probably place it at the same level. And I know it doesn't necessarily answer your question, but essentially what we see is the creation of an infrastructure that can be utilized in the future for further amplification of political content. So the creation of the infrastructure is probably the key portion here. We're thinking about a PR company that has the ability, the skill set, the staff to create the infrastructure, to use it, to deploy it, and to make it visible to audiences. Within that, we already see the injection of the political content. The fact that the original source, Times Newswire, was removing their own targeted attacks from the website shortly after posting that, makes me think that it's possible that the political content was not secondary at all. And this is very typical for influence operation. They need to be visible, but not too visible, not too obvious. They need to appear legitimate. So it's possibly at the same level. It was definitely financially driven and motivated in the sense that we could see IMI advertising their capability to place content on local media in Europe and elsewhere. We will see other agencies claiming the same ability and selling the same capability. But that was not it. That was not the entirety of the services that we're selling. The political content was very explicit and very targeted. So again, it was probably on the same level as the financially motivated behavior.
Thank you. Very interesting question. So in terms of like distribution of content, so you said like basically, I'm going to summarize three big pot of content, which was one like scraping actual news from other sources. It's called copyright infringement, if I'm not mistaken. Second part was the kind of advertisement, crypto, cars, other kind of companies, and then you had the third part, which is like the more propaganda part. In terms of distribution, are we looking at 30, 40, 50%, 20, 10%? Like what would be your guess there? Or your numbers?
Difficult to quantify in precise numbers, but I would say the state media content was much more, there was much more volume of state media content and was much more visible. The conspiracy theories were just injected there and not across the different network, the different websites in the network. But for example, in the Japanese example that I provided in one of the slides, it appeared to be present on the Japanese website only. So very targeted to the audience they wanted to reach. So again, the most potentially damaging content was only targeted to specific pieces of the audience they wanted to target overall. The Chinese state media content was mostly spread across the network. So that was much more frequent and visible.
Thank you. Many questions. You can still vote also for your questions so they get higher in the list. You said this has a minimal impact, and there's another question about impact. So first, and I'm going to group the two questions, like how did you measure impact of the operation? That's one. And second, do you think that the low impact was intentional, or it was just like the real impact of the operation?
I'll start with the first question. So the second one on the slide, how did we measure the impact? We use open source tools in order to quantify to the extent it was possible. And we make that clear in the report, of course, the amount of traffic coming to the website. You see that in the report, in the conclusions. The open source tools did not even have in their databases the vast majority of the websites, meaning they were not able to track them because there were not sufficient traffic to that. A couple of the websites, the one in English, had about, that we could see in the tools, about 50 unique visitors a day, which is a minimal number, of course. So the impact by that measure was minimal, but we didn't limit it to that. We also looked into whether any of the pieces of content, particularly the targeted attacks, but also conspiracy theories, were picked up and amplified across social media and or mainstream news, of course, in general, in the targeted audiences, in the countries that were targeted specifically, but also generally speaking in the West. We cannot find any examples of that. The websites themselves did not have a social media presence that we could find. So the network, Paperwall, did not have an official, so to speak, social media presence. Say, AFL Post, the French website, or 6 Italian website, they did not have a social media account each, which eliminated the social media amplification. We could not find much of that content at all, and it was limited to the website only. Which leads me to the other question, which was, if I remember correctly, I don't see it on the slide anymore. But what was the objective? Whether it was a test on experiment? Yes. It's a very interesting question. My answer is going to be speculation or an informed guess, because obviously it's difficult to quantify, to define the intent of an actor. But we wonder whether it could be a better version of a future influence operation, building the infrastructure, testing it, see whether it works, and then quantify how effective it could be in order to deploy the actual payload, so to speak, in the future. The other option could be the typical tactic of an influence operation will be to seed pieces of content that remain completely invisible or ignored by the vast majority of people for years even, and then be picked up at the right moment, or the moment they're picked up, there's no right moment. And at that moment, be impactful We saw that in Russian-driven operations before. This could be a very similar kind of tactic as well. So could be either of the two, a test or an actual production, so to speak, operation that took into account the ability or the patient to stay dormant and to stay invisible for years before being exposed.
Fantastic. You making a great connection for one of the other questions, which is any overlap with other Chinese information operations other than the high energy. Yanimeg is also a common target for spamouflage. So spamouflage, for people who don't know spamouflage is another operation that has been covered, if I remember, by Graphica. Kudos to Camille and Ben, François, Ben Nimo, and Jake there. Which was using usually like spammy content to post pro PCC content on Twitter, if I remember.
Short answer, yes. We see the overlap with spamouflage specifically, or potentially with spamouflage. We cannot attribute it specifically to spamouflage, but we could see social media accounts in this case, or Medium, or Medium.com posts and blogs, reposting or even posting prior to Paperwall some of the memes that we could see on Paperwall too. Specifically, if you remember the example of the attempt of blocking the professional opportunity for Jan Limang, we could see that spread. We could present that in the report. We could see that spread across a number of different online entities. We don't have attribution on the other entities. Could be anyone, technically speaking, but it's an interesting coincidence. Of course, it's the same exact content, the same exact meme. That's the only overlap that we see for now, but it's not surprising at all to me.
We have an excellent question about how to hold people accountable, but I'm going to keep it for the last question because this is opening so many other things. Staying with other influence operations, I think you answered, but the question was asked, so I'll address it. Have you seen China alone in this influence operation, or do you think there was also like pro-Russian content also around, or Russian actors around?
For Paperwall, we didn't see any evidence of connection with other governments or countries. There's no evidence that there was collusion or contribution by other governments at all, including Russia, unlike other operations that we analyzed before.
Yes, I think what's interesting in what you've been saying around like links with other operations is like the seeding process of not having a lot of impact, but seeding things is also something that we saw in secondary infection, which was a regional operation of seeding content on many platforms with burner accounts on many different places of the internet, and hoping this will at some point be recuperated and spread by others. So we also see that analyzing TTPs or modus operandi is not leading to attribution to an actor, because the playbooks are more and more integrated within different hostile actors using them. So a specific modus operandi does not lead to a specific actor anymore. And we could see that there is quite some heavy exchange of techniques and tactics and procedures between all of them now than it used to be maybe 5 or 10 years ago. On AI, do you think that AI-generated content will increase the scale and the speed of these operations?
It's a very interesting question that I got a number of times since we published, and it's an obvious question. Obvious in a good sense, in that we need to ask ourselves. Now, Paperwall was reposting content by stealing it, essentially from real news organizations, in order to look legit, in order to look like the content was affiliated with those news organizations. If in the future they're able, or similar networks are able to generate their own original content and to make it unique to each website in the local language, would that make the network more credible and more difficult to identify? Probably. Will that be deployed? Will that be easy to be deployed by actors? We'll see. And it will probably depend on a number of different factors that will be too complicated to analyze now. But to get to the question, I think it will possibly, depending on the deterrence factors, so for example, countermeasures by AI models and their deployment, it will definitely make easier are less constrained, it will definitely make it easier for an actor like this one to produce individually original content that will be almost indistinguishable, from real news content in the targeted country. So it's a danger that needs to be kept in mind.
Yes, at the same time, we also see these operations are also always run by a cost efficiency ratio. So of course, the more you use one tool that can do it all, the better it is, because you actually save time to do this. The downplay of this is that when you actually discover a tool has been used, you can also uncover more. So there is also this kind also of how AI can centralize part of the content production, or maybe further down into distribution of these websites on social platforms or elsewhere. But at some point, hostile actors also face resources and costs and have to use the most efficient tool with the most efficient result. And sometimes this could be done at the detriment of obfuscating an operation, or being able to actually remain still operating method and to be hidden much more easily also. So we're also at the beginning of this, and many interesting investigations are happening now on how to actually detect some kind of AI language model being used. We had an example, for instance, recently at Recorded Future webinar inside this, where Brian explained how certain type of wording and phrases were actually showing what kind of tools and what kind of AI generative tool was used by the attackers. Alberto, could you elaborate a bit more on the links between PR companies and the state apparatus? Because it's really something that is not very, I would say, known for people not doing investigations on a regular basis. Like we have this idea of when we talk about Russia, sorry, about the Kremlin, deciding everything that's happening and everything is centralized. It's very often not the case. It's very often the opposite, and with a lot of online intermediaries playing their role. How is this? Have you seen specific also in other operations specific relationships, or how does it work? This kind of really PR company and the states apparatus, and what does it mean for the future? Should we expect to see more of these companies popping up?
I think we're at the beginning of understanding the connection. Understanding the connection between the PR companies specifically and the Chinese government in question. In this case, Now, if we think about what Mandiant exposing with the high energy in 2022, 2023, they were also uncovering something that was previously not necessarily unimagined, but not proven, which was a direct collaboration between a PR company and the Chinese government, in this case, to spread content that was aligned with the Beijing positions, clearly. What we see here, and again, I'll go back to what's the problem motivation behind this operation, which is a mix between the financially driven side of the operation and the politically driven one. Now, the connection between the two is difficult for me to assess, because obviously we have no visibility into the connection between Haimai potentially and the Chinese government. They're based in Shenzhen. We know that they're an unknown entity prior to that, other than from the South Korean intelligence report that's public and describes them. But shortly before we published our own report, we're still in an early stage of understanding what the collaboration could be. And I think we need to take a look at what's visible, right? It's the only thing we can do. What's visible is the targeting. High Energy, that was a different company called Haixun, according to Mandiant. That company was targeting, their operation was targeting US and Canadian audiences, if I remember correctly, specifically US audiences. In our case, we have everything but the US. So it's possible that there's a division of labor between different agencies. We definitely see the financially motivated portion of it, selling placement of content on major European media, which are not major European media at all. But also the question that comes to mind is, we see regions that are not impacted at all. I'm thinking about Southeast Asia, I'm thinking about Africa. Are those regions impacted by other operations that we haven't detected yet, by other companies that we haven't found yet? That will be my main question. In terms of the relationship between the company itself and the Chinese government, we can only judge from what we can see in terms of the content being spread, the tactics being utilized, and to some extent also the reactions to the report itself, which was mostly muted. I wouldn't go beyond in assumptions because, again, that's the information we have available right now.
Thank you, Alberto. Something also that I found interesting, I would like you to elaborate a bit, because you've been mentioning the work of Mandiant and the work also that has been done in South Korea. I think there is also an important topic in our community in how we can all work together better to build on the findings of somebody else. How was it useful? Did you have conversation also with people that have worked before? Do you plan to have cooperation with people that have worked on this operation at different stages to actually have a better vision of the whole operation process, for instance?
It's possible. It's possible. I wouldn't necessarily mention specific collaborations at this stage, but it's possible. And we definitely reference the Mandiant investigation. I personally believe that was a very strong one. And it was definitely useful for us to recognize something that was not completely unknown, right? It was different and distinct, but it was not completely unknown. I think we need to build on each other's work. And that's why I mentioned, for example, the regions that are not impacted yet, because maybe the research community in general will be able to research on that and find more that we haven't seen yet.
Yes, very important. So now let's go to, we have the last two questions about what can we do? So as I often say, we did a very nice report, spent 2 weeks speaking to the press, explaining everything, not being happy enough when things are not described exactly as we wrote it, but that's life. And what's next? You say websites pop in, pop out, disappear, come back. So what's the best way to report? Is it through public exposure? Is there any way in holding this website accountable somehow? What's your take on this?
So obviously the first step that we like to take, and not only we like, but it's kind of our mission, is to expose them. And it's the approach that I believe works best, because obviously an influence operation only works if it's credible. And it's credible if it's not recognized as an influence operation. Exposing it as an influence operation diffuses it. And that's what's probably happening with Paperwall. Again, I mentioned that most of the websites are now down, not all of them, but it's easy for people to just analyze them and see that even the archive version that they were definitely an influence operation or part of an influence operation. What can we do against them in the future? Keeping them accountable is difficult. And that's what we discussed in the previous report that we put out in July last year about the older operation called Hong Kong Leaks, HK Leaks, starting the Hong Kong protests 2019, 2020. In that case, and we link back to the collaboration with Russia. We had the website hosted on a Russian registry, excuse me. That was DDoS-Guard hosting service, DDoS-Guard based in Russia. It's known, it's actually coming out these days for different reasons as well. It's known to be hosting very suspicious, dodgy organizations in general, and it was hosting this one too, this operation that we identified and described. Now, when you have that kind of collaboration, or even in the case of Paperwall, when they're hosted on Chinese servers, it's actually difficult to keep them accountable from a technical perspective or legal perspective. From a technical perspective, there might be solutions, but it's probably beyond our conversation today to propose them. I do believe that we need to start thinking about potential countermeasures that go beyond the exposure, the public exposure, and then we look into automatic detection, automatic blocking, or other measures that, again, won't get too much into the details because it requires a number of different experts and expertise pieces that I don't necessarily have, and I want to acknowledge that. It requires conversation specifically on the accountability. What can we do? And what can we do from a legal point of view, from a technical point of view, and a policy point of view as well? Then you have the aspect of social media. In this case, obviously, that's not applicable because Paperwall did not have a social media presence. But in case that happened, that would require an action by the social media companies, the platforms hosting the content. And that would require different actions too. That would probably make accountability a little easier, knowing the general approach by social media platforms to remove this kind of operations. But that will probably not be sufficient, particularly when you have a large network of websites which are independently hosted in countries that are not interested in collaborating at all, including the country that's probably running it.
Yes, complex topic, and also valid for many other operations which operate these kind of strong networks. I can only recommend our colleague Joe McNamee at the DisinfoLab released a short paper last week on the good, the bad, and the pointless, on how to where to find the right intermediary. And starting with sentence, the closest you are to the offense, the better it is. So could be ad networks sometimes, because some of these advertisements on these websites are against advertisement policies of the companies that are using these services. Sometimes could be domain names, sometimes could be others. I find it interesting that, and unfortunately, plagiarism and copyright infringement in that case would also be a way to act against this website and to prevent them for stealing content online, and to build their reputation and their credibility upon the reputation of others. So yes, many open things that could be done over these networks, as we call them now, dummy media outlet networks that are proliferating in many operations. Alberto?
In fact, if I can say one more thing very quickly, Alexandre, a bit more concrete maybe, we need to find ways to attack the financial aspect of it. We keep in mind the political aspect, because obviously that's the most damaging and probably the main goal of this kind of operations. But in order to sustain themselves, and we presented that with Paperwall, there's an important financial aspect. They're selling services to clients. We see companies advertising like that. Now, if we are able, from a legal perspective, for example, or even a technical one, to attack the financial aspect and undermine their ability to generate money, quite frankly, at that point, we will undermine the entire infrastructure, and we will rely exclusively on financing that is not publicly available in that case, so publicly open to the public, and that will make it more costly for them to run this kind of operations than now.
Again, coming back to cost efficiency, and to make sure to realize how much the impact is, and the more you give it credit when it doesn't have, the more it justifies credit that the hostile actors can request to continue their work. So also having a fair assessment of the real impact of these campaigns is hugely crucial. Anything else you would like to add, Alberto? We are running out of questions, so if nothing more, we're going to slowly go down to the closing of this webinar. Any next steps on your side, Alberto, on Paperwall? You have a secret investigations being released 10 days from now, and you want to tell everybody about it, or not anything
Sure.
right now?
No.
Too bad. Thanks a lot, Alberto. It was really a pleasure to have you. And I'm sure our path will meet again for sure in the next weeks and months. Hope to see you at the EU DisinfoLab conference. We just opened registration last week. So if you have not already registered to the conference, we'll be waiting for you this year in Riga, 9 and 10 October, disinfo.eu/conference. Many other investigations, many other content will be proposed, and we hope to see you there. Meanwhile, we have our series of webinars which will continue every week. So next week, we'll go deeper, and we'll have a webinar with the European Commission. Silvia Merizo from DG Connect will be moderated by my colleague Joe on the Digital Services Act, on data access and scrutiny. What should we expect in terms of data access under the DSA in Europe? This will be very important after the announce of shutting down of CrowdTangle, and many kind of difficulties to access APIs from platforms. So this is one good way to understand what the regulation would provide for researchers, and what the Commission expects to receive and to put in place in the next month and years. So I really encourage you to join us if you are interested in these topics. If you're into climate change disinformation, my colleague Anna on 16 April will run something in the frame of our Climate Clarity Hub on platforms and climate disinformation with Devin Bachechi. On 25 April, we'll look at tools and techniques for using AI in digital investigations, and we'll have the pleasure to have Craig Silverman from ProPublica. That will also be very interesting and very useful. Maybe for your next investigations, Alberto, a few tips to get there from Craig. So thank you for this. You will also be able to see us in other foreign interference content in the framework of our Athena project or other project that we have. We plan to release a few things very soon. So thank you everybody for your time, and you will receive an email with all the information to register to these webinars and to our conference tomorrow. Thanks a lot and have a great day, everybody. Thanks again, Alberto, for your time.